Late night, a scary, true horror story. It was a cold winter night, and David had just finished his late shift at the diner. He hated working late, but the extra money was necessary. The streets were nearly empty, with only a few flickering streetlights casting long shadows. As he walked home, a strange feeling crept over him, like someone was watching. The man in the alley. David's usual route took him through a dimly lit alley that cut across town. As he entered, the air felt different, thicker, heavier. A chill ran down his spine when he noticed a man standing at the far end of the alley, barely visible in the darkness. The man didn't move, didn't blink. He just stood there. David quickened his pace, trying to ignore him, but as he got closer, the man's face became clearer. His eyes were black, empty, soulless voids. His mouth curled into a grotesque grin, revealing teeth that looked unnaturally sharp. The chase begins. David's heart pounded as he walked past the man, trying not to make eye contact. But the moment he passed him, he heard slow footsteps following. Then the footsteps got faster. David broke into a sprint, his breath ragged as he reached the end of the alley. He turned back for just a second. The man was running straight at him, unnaturally fast. He bolted across the street, barely avoiding a passing car. He didn't stop running until he reached his apartment building. The elevator incident. David slammed the door shut behind him, panting. He pressed the elevator button repeatedly, glancing back through the glass door. The man was standing outside, watching. The elevator doors opened. David rushed inside and pressed his floor number, his hands trembling. As the doors began to close, he let out a breath of relief until something stopped them. A hand. David's stomach dropped as he saw the man's pale, bony fingers prying the doors open. But just before the doors could fully open, something strange happened. The lights flickered violently, and the elevator plunged into darkness. The doors slammed shut on their own, and the elevator shot upward. The whispering shadows. When the lights flickered back on, David found himself on the wrong floor. The doors creaked open to reveal a hallway that didn't belong to his building. The walls were old, stained with something dark. A single dim bulb flickered at the end of the corridor. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and decay. Then he heard it. A whisper. Not just one. Multiple whispers all around him. The voices were too quiet to understand, but they grew louder, more urgent. David turned around to press the elevator button, but there was no elevator anymore, just a blank wall. The figure at the end of the hall. At the far end of the hallway, a shadow moved. A tall, thin figure stepped forward, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. Then it crawled toward him, fast, too fast. David screamed and stumbled backward. He turned to run, but suddenly the floor beneath him collapsed. Back to reality? David gasped as he hit the ground, his eyes snapping open. He was lying on the floor inside the elevator. The doors were wide open, showing the familiar hallway of his actual apartment building. Shaking, he scrambled to his feet and rushed to his apartment, locking the door behind him. He didn't sleep that night. The final glimpse. The next morning, David convinced himself it had been a nightmare. But as he stepped out of his apartment, he froze. Near the elevator, something was carved into the wall. 4 simple words, scratched deep into the paint. See you again, soon. And below it, a bloody handprint. A restless night. David barely slept after the horrifying events of the night before. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that grin, those black eyes, the thing crawling toward him. By morning, he tried to convince himself it was exhaustion, just his mind playing tricks. But the words carved into the wall near the elevator, "See you again, soon," reminded him that this was no dream. He needed to get out of the apartment, clear his head. The stranger on the bus. David took a bus to work, staring blankly out the window. The city looked normal, alive with people, but he felt like he was out of place, like something was watching. Halfway through the ride, an old woman sitting nearby turned to him and muttered, "It followed you, didn't it?" David's breath caught. He looked at her in shock. What?" he stammered. The woman didn't answer. She just stared at him with cloudy, sunken eyes before whispering, "Don't go back. It's waiting." The bus came to a sudden stop, and before David could ask anything else, the woman vanished into the crowd. A sinister message. That evening, David hesitated before returning home. He even considered staying at a motel, but his wallet said otherwise. He stepped into the elevator, his pulse racing as the doors slid shut. The ride was silent until his phone buzzed. A text message. "Unknown number. Look behind you." David's throat tightened. He refused to turn around. The elevator doors opened to his floor, and he practically ran to his apartment. But the moment he entered, his phone buzzed again. "Unknown number. You forgot to say hello." His heart nearly stopped. He turned slowly toward the hallway, toward the elevator, and there, standing in the dimly lit corridor, was the man from the alley, the silent stalker. David's body locked up. He wanted to run, but he couldn't move. The man didn't blink, didn't breathe, just stood there, watching. Then, a single step forward. David slammed his door shut and locked it. His breathing was ragged, his mind racing. He grabbed a kitchen knife and backed away from the door. Silence. Then, a slow, deliberate knock. David gripped the knife tighter, his knuckles white. Another knock, then another, and then a whisper through the door. "Let me in." The dark corridor. David didn't sleep. The knocking stopped after an hour, but the unease lingered. Around 3 a.m., he decided to check the peephole. Nothing. The hallway was empty. Cautiously, he unlocked the door and stepped outside. The hallway felt wrong, longer than usual. The lights flickered. He turned toward the elevator. It was open. Inside, the dim light revealed scratches all over the walls, deep, jagged claw marks, and in the center of the floor, a single, blood-stained note. He hesitated, then picked it up. One sentence written in smeared ink. "You should never have looked." Dragged into the darkness, a sudden gust of cold air rushed through the hallway. The lights flickered wildly. A deep guttural growl echoed from behind him. David turned and saw a figure standing at the far end of the hallway. It was not the man. It was something worse. A tall, shadowy thing with hollow eyes and elongated limbs. Its head tilted in a way no humans could. And then it moved. Not walking, not running, but flickering closer, like a skipping video. David gasped, stepping backward into the elevator. The doors slammed shut on their own. The lights flickered, and everything went black. The forgotten floor. When the lights returned, David was still in the elevator, but the doors opened to a floor that didn't exist. A place that smelled of rotting wood and something metallic, like blood. A dim hallway stretched before him, identical to his own, but wrong. The walls pulsed, shadows moved where they shouldn't, and at the very end, standing deathly still, was himself. David stared in horror at his own reflection, standing at the end of the hallway, grinning. Then, the thing that looked like him started walking forward. The reflection that walked David's breath hitched. His own reflection, or whatever that thing was, stood at the far end of the hallway, grinning. It was identical to him, except for its eyes. Black, empty, hungry. Then it moved. Not walking, gliding. Its feet barely touched the ground as it slid toward him, its grin widening unnaturally. David stepped backward into the elevator, frantically pressing the buttons. Nothing worked. His reflection whispered, though its lips barely moved, "You don't belong here." The elevator doors slammed shut. The descent into nowhere. Instead of going up or down, the elevator shook violently. The light overhead flickered, casting sharp shadows across the walls. A distant, eerie laughter echoed from somewhere above or below. David gripped the handrails, his heart racing. Then, the elevator dropped. Not a normal descent, a free fall. The walls trembled, the air pressure vanished, and David's stomach lurched. He screamed, but no sound came out. Just as suddenly, the elevator stopped. The doors slid open to pure darkness, a place where nothing existed. No walls, no ceiling, just an endless void. And then from the shadows, a hand reached out. The whispering thing. A long bony hand with sharp fingers curled around the door frame. Then another, and another. Something crawled out of the darkness. Tall, thin, with too many arms. Its head twisted unnaturally, snapping into place as it turned toward him. The whispering began. Soft at first, then louder. Words he didn't understand. Words that made his vision blur, his skin crawl. Then, in a voice that sounded like his own, it spoke. "You should have stayed asleep." The thing lunged. The escape that wasn't David hit the emergency button. The doors slammed shut just before the thing's claws could reach him. The elevator jerked, shooting upward. The ride was violent, unnatural. The walls stretched, twisted, groaned. The lights flickered, revealing glimpses of shadows crawling outside the elevator. Then, silence. The elevator stopped. The doors opened, and David was back in his apartment building. Or so he thought. A home that wasn't home. Stepping out cautiously, everything looked normal. The walls, the hallway, the dim lights. His apartment door was right there. He hesitated before turning the handle. Inside his apartment was exactly as he left it. The same furniture, the same dim lamp flickering in the corner. But something felt off. The air was too still. The silence, too deep. Then he saw it. On his coffee table, his phone. A message was already open, from an unknown number. "Look in the mirror." The final horror. David's stomach twisted. Slowly, he turned toward the mirror hanging on the wall. His reflection stood there, but it didn't move. David raised his hand. His reflection didn't. It just smiled. A wide, unnatural, terrifying smile. And then, it stepped forward. To be continued.